The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Camilla Henderson's bedroom window, casting delicate shadows across her mahogany dresser. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the letter that had arrived 3 days ago. The royal seal still gleamed in the light, but the words inside had already changed everything she thought she knew about her life. Camilla had always been the quiet one in her family. While her sister Margaret commanded attention at every social gathering, Camilla preferred the company of books and her beloved garden. At 28, she had built a simple but fulfilling life as a librarian in the small town of Millbrook. Her days were predictable, comfortable, and entirely her own. The letter had shattered that peaceful existence. It was from her grandmother's estate lawyer, informing her that she had inherited not just a cottage in Scotland, but also a title she never knew existed: Lady Camilla of Rosewood Manor. It sounded like something from a fairy tale. The inheritance came with conditions, however. She had to leave Millbrook within 2 weeks and take residence at the manor to claim her birthright. Her grandmother, Eleanor Rosewood, had been a mystery throughout Camilla's childhood. She remembered brief visits when she was very young, a tall woman with silver hair who always smelled like lavender and spoke with a slight Scottish accent. Eleanor had vanished from their lives when Camilla was 10, and her parents had always been vague about the reasons why. Now, holding the letter, Camilla realized there had been family secrets she was never told. The inheritance papers revealed that Eleanor had been nobility and that Camilla was the last surviving heir to a centuries-old estate. The manor came with responsibilities, traditions, and expectations that felt overwhelming to someone who had lived such a quiet life. Her best friend Sarah had been both excited and worried when Camilla shared the news. They sat in their favorite coffee shop, the one where they had met every Tuesday for the past 5 years, and Sarah could hardly contain her enthusiasm. "This is incredible, Cam! You're like a real-life princess now," Sarah had exclaimed, her eyes bright with excitement. But Camilla felt only uncertainty. "I don't know anything about being nobility. I don't even know how to curtsy properly. What if I make a fool of myself?" Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're the most graceful person I know. Besides, it's your birthright. Your grandmother chose you for a reason." The conversation had given Camilla some comfort, but it hadn't erased her fears. She spent the following days researching Rosewood Manor online, trying to learn about her new home. The estate was vast, with gardens that had been featured in architectural magazines. The manor itself dated back to the 1600s and had been in the Rosewood family for generations. What troubled Camilla most was a recurring theme in the articles she found. The Rosewood family had a history of women who inherited the estate and then mysteriously disappeared or died young. Her grandmother Eleanor had been the exception, living at the manor for 60 years before her death. But Eleanor's mother, aunt, and great-grandmother had all met unfortunate ends. Camilla tried to dismiss these concerns as coincidence, but they nagged at her as she prepared for the move. She gave notice at the library, where her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was both sad to lose her and proud of her good fortune. "You've always had a special quality about you, dear," Mrs. Chen had said on Camilla's last day. "Something that set you apart. Maybe this inheritance is just the world recognizing what we've always known." The packing had been emotional. Each book she wrapped, each photograph she carefully placed in boxes, felt like saying goodbye to the person she had been. Her small apartment had been her sanctuary for 5 years, and leaving it felt like abandoning a part of herself. Her parents had been strangely quiet about the inheritance. When she called to tell them the news, there had been a long pause on the other end of the line. Her mother's voice had been tight when she finally responded. "Are you certain you want to do this, sweetheart? Sometimes it's better to leave the past buried." Her father had taken the phone then, his tone more supportive, but still cautious. "If this is what you want, we'll support you, but promise us you'll be careful, and call us every day." Their reaction had puzzled Camilla. She had expected them to be happy for her, perhaps even proud that their family had noble connections. Instead, they seemed worried, almost fearful. When she pressed them for more information about Eleanor and the family history, they deflected her questions and changed the subject. The final week before her departure had passed in a blur of preparations. She arranged for her car to be shipped to Scotland, sorted through years of belongings, and said difficult goodbyes to colleagues and neighbors. Each farewell felt heavier than the last, as if she was leaving forever rather than simply moving to a new home. The night before her flight, Camilla sat in her empty apartment, surrounded by sealed boxes and suitcases. The familiar space looked foreign without her belongings, and she felt a deep sense of loss. She had never been one for big changes, preferring the comfort of routine and familiar surroundings. Her phone rang, interrupting her melancholy thoughts. It was Margaret, calling from her home in California. "I still can't believe my boring little sister is becoming a Scottish lady," Margaret teased, but her voice carried an underlying note of concern. "I'm not becoming anything," Camilla replied. "I'm just accepting what's already mine, I suppose. Mom and Dad are worried sick, you know. They keep saying things about family curses and bad luck. It's all nonsense, of course, but they're genuinely concerned." Camilla had heard the whispers about curses, but she had dismissed them as superstition. Now, hearing the worry in her sister's voice, she felt a chill of unease. "Do you think I'm making a mistake?" she asked quietly. Margaret's response was immediate and firm. "No, I think you're finally having an adventure. You've played it safe your whole life, Cam. Maybe it's time to see what else is out there for you." That conversation had stayed with Camilla through her restless night. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of her soon-to-be former home, she thought about the woman she had been and the woman she might become. The inheritance offered her opportunities she had never imagined, but it also demanded that she leave behind everything familiar and comfortable. The morning of her departure dawned gray and drizzly, matching her mood. Sarah arrived early to drive her to the airport, bringing coffee and pastries from their favorite bakery. They didn't talk much during the drive, both lost in their own thoughts. At the airport, their goodbye was tearful and prolonged. Sarah made her promise to video call every week and to send pictures of the manor. As Camilla walked toward the security checkpoint, she turned back one last time to see Sarah waving, tears streaming down her face. The flight to Edinburgh was long and gave Camilla too much time to think. She stared out the window at clouds and ocean, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The woman sitting next to her was reading a romance novel about a woman who inherited a castle, and Camilla couldn't help but smile at the irony. As the plane began its descent into Scotland, Camilla caught her first glimpse of the Highlands. The landscape was breathtaking, with rolling hills covered in purple heather and ancient stone walls marking property boundaries. It looked like something from a movie, beautiful and wild and completely different from the gentle countryside of her hometown. The estate's lawyer, Mr. MacLeod, was waiting for her at the airport. He was a kind-faced man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a warm Scottish accent. As they drove through the countryside toward Rosewood Manor, he filled her in on the practical details of her inheritance. "The manor has been maintained by a small staff," he explained. "Mrs. Ferguson has been the housekeeper for 30 years, and there's a groundskeeper named Jamie who tends the gardens and maintains the property. They've been looking forward to meeting you." The drive took nearly 2 hours, winding through increasingly remote countryside. As they traveled, Mr. MacLeod shared stories about the estate and the Rosewood family history. Camilla learned that her grandmother had been something of a local legend, known for her charitable work and her extensive gardens. "Eleanor was a remarkable woman," Mr. MacLeod said with obvious affection. "She modernized the estate while respecting its traditions. The manor is profitable now thanks to her efforts. You won't have to worry about financial difficulties." As the sun began to set, they finally turned onto a private road marked by an ornate iron gate. The drive was lined with ancient oak trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead. After what felt like miles, the trees gave way to manicured gardens, and then Camilla saw Rosewood Manor for the first time. The sight took her breath away. The manor was even more magnificent than the photographs had suggested. Built from gray stone that glowed golden in the evening light, it rose 4 stories high with numerous chimneys and windows that gleamed like jewels. Ivy-covered portions of the walls and the formal gardens stretched out in all directions, filled with roses that seemed to glow in the twilight. "Welcome home, Lady Camilla," Mr. McLeod said softly. As they pulled up to the front entrance, Camilla saw a woman standing in the doorway. Mrs. Ferguson was exactly what she had imagined a Scottish housekeeper would look like, round-faced and rosy-cheeked, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a practical dark dress with an apron. "Welcome to Rosewood Manor, my lady," Mrs. Ferguson said with a curtsy that made Camilla feel immediately awkward about her new status. "Please, just call me Camilla," she replied, extending her hand. Mrs. Ferguson smiled warmly and shook her hand with both of hers. "Your grandmother always said you'd come home eventually. She'd be so pleased to see you here." That first evening at the manor passed in a blur of introductions and explorations. Mrs. Ferguson showed her through the main rooms, each one more impressive than the last. The library alone was larger than Camilla's entire apartment had been, with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books collected over centuries. Her bedroom was in the family wing, a spacious suite with windows overlooking the rose garden. Mrs. Ferguson had prepared everything perfectly, with fresh flowers on the dresser and a fire crackling in the ornate fireplace. It was beautiful, but it felt impossibly grand for someone who had lived so simply. As Camilla unpacked her few belongings in the enormous wardrobe, everything she owned seemed small and insignificant in the grandeur of the manor. She found herself wondering how she would ever feel at home in such a place. That night, as she lay in the 4-poster bed that had belonged to generations of Rosewood women, Camilla listened to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home. The manor creaked and settled around her, and she could hear the wind moving through the trees outside her windows. She thought about her quiet life in Millbrook, about Sarah and her cozy apartment and her simple routines. Everything she had known was gone now, replaced by responsibilities and expectations she didn't understand. As she finally drifted off to sleep, she whispered a prayer that she would prove worthy of the trust her grandmother had placed in her. 3 weeks had passed since Camilla's arrival at Rosewood Manor, and she was beginning to find her rhythm in this new life. The morning routine she had established helped ease the transition. She would wake before sunrise, make tea in the small kitchenette Mrs. Ferguson had set up in her suite, and walk through the gardens as the dew sparkled on the roses. The gardens had become her sanctuary. Jamie McBride, the groundskeeper, was a man of few words but infinite patience. He had been working at the manor since he was 16, and now at 45 he knew every plant, every path, and every seasonal change by heart. He taught Camilla about the different varieties of roses her grandmother had cultivated, each one chosen for a specific reason. "Your grandmother had a special connection with growing things," Jamie explained one morning as they walked past the Heritage Rose Garden. "She could coax blooms from plants that others had given up for dead. Said it was about listening to what they needed." Camilla found herself drawn to this philosophy. In her previous life, she had maintained a small herb garden on her apartment balcony, but here she could learn about gardening on a grand scale. Jamie showed her the greenhouse where Eleanor had propagated new varieties, the cutting garden that supplied flowers for the manor, and the medicinal garden where herbs had been grown for centuries. "Lady Eleanor spent most of her mornings here," Mrs. Ferguson told her one day as they had afternoon tea in the conservatory. "She said the gardens helped her think clearly. Whenever she had a difficult decision to make, she would come out here with her pruning shears and work until she found her answer. The more Camilla learned about her grandmother, the more she realized how much Eleanor had accomplished. The woman had not only maintained the estate, but had expanded it, adding a small vineyard that now produced award-winning wines. She had also established a foundation that provided scholarships for local young people to attend university. "Your grandmother believed in giving back," Mr. McLeod explained during one of their weekly meetings. "The Rosewood Foundation has sent over 200 young people to university in the past 30 years. She would want you to continue that tradition." These responsibilities felt overwhelming at first. Camilla had never managed anything larger than her small department at the library, and now she was expected to oversee an estate, make decisions about investments, and continue philanthropic work. But gradually, with the patient guidance of Mrs. Ferguson and Mr. McLeod, she began to understand the scope of her new role. The local community had been curious about the new lady of Rosewood Manor. Invitations to various social events had been arriving steadily, and Mrs. Ferguson encouraged her to accept them. "It's important for the manor to maintain its connections with the community," she advised. "Your grandmother was very social, despite her reputation for being somewhat particular about certain things." The first social event Camilla attended was a charity luncheon in the nearby village of Braeburn. She had agonized over what to wear, settling finally on a simple navy dress that Mrs. Ferguson had assured her was appropriate. As she entered the village hall, she felt every eye turned toward her. The women of the community were polite but reserved, clearly taking her measure. Camilla found herself seated next to Dr. Margaret Ross, the local physician, who proved to be a welcome ally. "Don't mind the stares," Dr. Ross whispered. "They're just curious. Your grandmother was something of an enigma, and they're hoping you'll be more accessible." As the afternoon progressed, Camilla relaxed and began to enjoy herself. She learned about local concerns, from the need for updated playground equipment at the village school to worries about young people leaving the area for lack of opportunities. These were problems she felt she could help address through the foundation. "Your grandmother did wonderful work," said Mrs. Campbell, the head of the village council. "But she was always very private. We hope you might be more involved in community activities." Camilla promised to consider various volunteer opportunities, and by the end of the event, she felt she had made several potential friends. The experience gave her confidence that she could find her place in this new world. However, not everything about her new life was proving easy to navigate. There were moments when she felt the weight of the manor's history pressing down on her. Walking through the family portrait gallery, she studied the faces of previous Rosewood women and noticed a pattern that troubled her. Many of the women in the paintings looked sad, even haunted. Their eyes held a wariness that spoke of burdens and secrets. Eleanor's portrait, painted when she was about Camilla's age, showed a beautiful woman with intelligent eyes, but even she had that same guarded expression. Mrs. Ferguson found her in the gallery one afternoon, staring up at the portraits. "They're quite striking, aren't they?" the housekeeper said softly. "They all look so melancholy," Camilla observed, "even the ones painted for happy occasions like weddings." Mrs. Ferguson nodded thoughtfully. "The Rosewood women have always taken their responsibilities very seriously, perhaps too seriously at times." "Mrs. Ferguson, what happened to them? I've been researching the family history, and so many of the women died young or disappeared. Was my grandmother really the only one to live a full life?" The older woman's expression grew troubled. She glanced around the empty gallery before speaking in a lower voice. "Your grandmother lived longer than the others, yes. But even she, well, there were things that worried her, especially in her later years." "What kinds of things?" Before Mrs. Ferguson could answer, they heard footsteps in the corridor. Jamie appeared in the doorway, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of agitation. "Mrs. Ferguson, "Could I speak with you privately?" he asked, his eyes flickering toward Camilla with an expression she couldn't read. "Of course. Lady Camilla, if you'll excuse us." They left her alone in the gallery, speaking in hushed tones as they walked away. Camilla remained among the portraits, wondering what they weren't telling her. She had noticed that both Mrs. Ferguson and Jamie sometimes exchanged meaningful looks when certain subjects came up, as if they were sharing knowledge they didn't want her to have. That evening, Camilla decided to explore more of the manor on her own. She had been given a comprehensive tour when she arrived, but there were still rooms and areas she hadn't investigated thoroughly. Armed with a flashlight and her curiosity, she began exploring the older sections of the building. In what had once been the manor's original kitchen, she found a collection of old household journals dating back to the 1800s. The handwriting was difficult to read, but she managed to decipher entries that revealed patterns of strange occurrences. Servants wrote about unexplained sounds, objects moving on their own, and previous ladies of the manor displaying increasingly erratic behavior before their untimely deaths. One entry, dated 1923, particularly caught her attention. The housekeeper of that time had written, "Lady Catherine grows more agitated each day. She speaks of voices calling to her from the gardens at night. Dr. Morrison has been summoned, but she refuses to see him. I fear for her safety." The entry was followed by a gap of several weeks, and then a brief note. "Lady Catherine was found this morning in the rose garden pond. The constable says it was an accident, but I know she could swim like a fish. God rest her troubled soul." Camilla felt a chill as she read these accounts. They seemed to describe a pattern of mental deterioration, followed by death or disappearance. Was this what had worried her grandmother? Was this why her parents had been reluctant about her accepting the inheritance? Over the following days, she continued to research, using both the manor's extensive library and online resources. What she found disturbed her more with each discovery. The Rosewood family had been touched by tragedy for generations, with a particular pattern affecting the women who inherited the estate. She also began to notice things herself that couldn't be easily explained. Sometimes she heard footsteps in the corridors at night when she knew she was alone in her wing of the manor. Occasionally, she would find doors she was certain she had closed standing open. Once, she discovered a book lying open on the library table to a page about Scottish folklore and ancient curses, though she had no memory of reading it. Mrs. Ferguson seemed increasingly concerned about her. Several times she had found the housekeeper watching her with worried eyes, as if looking for signs of something troubling. "Are you sleeping well, my lady?" she would ask. "You look tired." Camilla was sleeping poorly, troubled by vivid dreams that felt more like memories than products of her imagination. In these dreams, she walked through the gardens with women she didn't recognize, listening to voices that spoke of ancient obligations and prices that must be paid. She began to wonder if the stress of her new responsibilities was affecting her mental health. The isolation of the manor, combined with the pressure of living up to her grandmother's legacy, might be taking a toll she hadn't recognized. One evening, as she sat in the conservatory reading, she heard something that made her heart stop. From somewhere in the gardens came the sound of a woman crying, a mournful wailing that seemed to drift on the night wind. She looked out the windows, but saw nothing except the moonlit paths and shadowy rose bushes. The sound continued for several minutes before fading away, leaving her wondering if she had imagined it. But the next morning, Jamie approached her with obvious reluctance. "Lady Camilla, I need to tell you something," he said, his usually confident manner subdued. "Last night I saw you in the gardens around midnight. You were walking toward the old rose garden, but when I called to you, you didn't answer. I followed to make sure you were safe, but when I got there, you were gone." Camilla stared at him in confusion. "That's impossible. I was in the conservatory all evening. I never went outside. Jamie's expression grew more troubled. I know what I saw, my lady, and this morning I found footprints in the dew leading from the manor to the Heritage Rose section, the same path I saw you taking. That afternoon, Camilla called Dr. Ross, the physician she had met at the charity luncheon. She arranged for a private consultation, claiming she was concerned about adjusting to her new environment. Dr. Ross was kind and thorough, but found nothing physically wrong. Stress and major life changes can sometimes cause sleep disturbances, she explained. You might be experiencing a form of sleepwalking triggered by the anxiety of your new situation. It's not uncommon. The explanation was reassuring, but Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that something more significant was happening. That evening, she decided to take precautions. She moved a chair in front of her bedroom door and placed bells on the handle. If she was sleepwalking, she would wake herself up before leaving the room. But when she woke the next morning, the chair was still in place and the bells were undisturbed. Yet Jamie again reported seeing her in the gardens, this time near the pond where Lady Catherine had drowned nearly a century ago. The contradiction was maddening. Either Jamie was lying, which seemed completely out of character, or something was happening that defied rational explanation. Camilla began to suspect that the family history she had been researching might hold more truth than she wanted to accept. That evening, she confronted Mrs. Ferguson directly. I need to know the truth about my grandmother and what happened to the other women in my family. Something is happening to me, and I can't address it if I don't understand it. Mrs. Ferguson's composure finally cracked. Tears filled her eyes as she sank into a chair in the morning room. Your grandmother made me promise never to speak of it unless it became absolutely necessary. She hoped that perhaps with you things might be different. But I can see now that the pattern is beginning again. What pattern? What are you talking about? Mrs. Ferguson took a shaky breath before continuing. The manor, it's not just a home, Lady Camilla. It's bound to your family by something that goes back centuries. Each woman who inherits it becomes part of that binding. Your grandmother spent 60 years trying to find a way to break it, but she never succeeded. She only learned to manage it. Camilla felt the world shifting around her as she tried to process this information. You're talking about some kind of supernatural curse? Call it what you like. Your grandmother called it an obligation. The manor and its lands have been protected by this binding for over 400 years. In return for that protection, each generation must pay a price. What kind of price? Mrs. Ferguson's voice dropped to a whisper. The woman who inherits must serve as a guardian. She becomes connected to the land in ways that most people couldn't understand or survive. Some of your ancestors were stronger than others. The weak ones didn't last long. Camilla sank into her own chair, her mind reeling. And you've known about this all along? You let me come here knowing what might happen to me? Your grandmother believed you might be strong enough. She said you had something the others lacked, a genuine love of growing things, a natural connection to the earth. She thought that might make the transition easier for you. As Mrs. Ferguson spoke, Camilla felt a strange sense of recognition. The dreams she had been having, the feeling of being called to the gardens, even the sense that she understood the needs of plants almost instinctively. It all began to make a different kind of sense. The sleepwalking Jamie has been witnessing, that's part of it, isn't it? I'm not actually sleepwalking, Mrs. Towers. Ferguson nodded sadly. The binding begins slowly. First you feel drawn to the land. Then you begin to see and hear things others cannot. Eventually you become so connected that you can never leave. That's why the other women seemed to disappear. They didn't die, exactly. They became part of something larger. That night, Camilla lay awake staring at the ceiling, everything she thought she knew about her new life crumbling around her. The inheritance that had seemed like a fairy tale gift was actually a trap that had claimed generations of women from her family. But even as fear gripped her, she felt another emotion emerging, a strange sense of belonging that she couldn't deny. Despite everything she had just learned, she couldn't imagine leaving Rosewood Manor. The thought of abandoning the gardens, the estate, and the community that was beginning to depend on her felt like a betrayal of everything she was meant to be. As dawn broke over the highlands, Camilla finally understood why her grandmother's portrait had shown such complexity in her eyes. Eleanor had known exactly what she was passing on, and she had chosen her heir carefully. Now it was Camilla's turn to discover whether she was strong enough to bear the weight of the Rosewood legacy. The revelation about the binding had changed everything for Camilla, yet paradoxically, it had also brought a strange sense of clarity. In the days following her conversation with Mrs. Ferguson, she found herself approaching her situation with the methodical mindset that had served her well as a librarian. If there was a supernatural obligation tied to her inheritance, then she needed to research it thoroughly and understand exactly what she was dealing with. Mrs. Ferguson, clearly relieved to no longer carry the secret alone, became an invaluable source of information. She led Camilla to a hidden room behind the library's main wall, accessible through a concealed door that had been built into the original architecture. The room contained Eleanor's private study, untouched since her death. "Your grandmother spent the last 20 years of her life documenting everything she could learn about the binding," Mrs. Ferguson explained as they entered the dusty chamber. "She hoped that someday, someone in the family would be able to find a solution." The study was filled with research materials that would have impressed any academic. Eleanor had collected historical documents, folklore texts, genealogical records, and even correspondence with scholars who specialized in Celtic mysticism. Her handwriting filled dozens of journals, chronicling her attempts to understand the supernatural forces that governed Rosewood Manor. Camilla spent the next week immersed in her grandmother's research. What emerged was a complex picture of her family's history that stretched back to the early 1600s. The original Rosewood Manor had been built by her ancestor, Lady Moira Rosewood, during a time of great upheaval in Scotland. Facing threats from both English forces and Scottish clans who resented her family's growing wealth and influence, Moira had reportedly made a pact with ancient forces to protect her land and people. According to the documents Eleanor had collected, Moira had sought out a woman known locally as the Green Lady, a figure who existed somewhere between folklore and historical fact. The Green Lady was said to have power over the land itself, able to make crops flourish or fail, to call favorable weather or devastating storms. Eleanor's research suggested that Moira had offered herself and her female descendants as guardians of the land in exchange for permanent protection for Rosewood Manor and its surrounding community. The bargain had worked. The estate had survived wars, famines, and social upheavals that had destroyed other great houses. But each woman who inherited the estate became bound to fulfill the role of guardian, serving as a bridge between the human world and the natural forces that protected the land. "The binding manifests differently in each generation," Eleanor had written in one journal entry. "Some women become so overwhelmed by the connection that they lose themselves entirely. Others, like myself, learn to work with the forces rather than against them. The key is understanding that we are not victims of this arrangement. We are partners in it." As Camilla read through her grandmother's meticulous notes, she began to understand the strange experiences she had been having. The sense of being called to the gardens, the instinctive knowledge of what the plants needed, even the episodes Jamie had witnessed, these were all signs that the binding was beginning to manifest in her. Eleanor had documented her own transition in detail. She described the same initial confusion and fear that Camilla was experiencing, followed by gradual acceptance and eventually a deep appreciation for the role she had been chosen to play. The hardest part, Eleanor had written, is the isolation. Humans are not meant to be bridges between worlds. There will be times when you feel cut off from ordinary human relationships, when your responsibilities as a guardian seem more important than your personal desires. This is why so many of our ancestors seemed melancholy. They felt the weight of their obligations without understanding their purpose. But Eleanor had also written about the rewards of accepting the binding. She described experiences that sounded mystical. Being able to sense the health of the entire ecosystem, feeling connected to every living thing on the estate, understanding the subtle communications of plants and animals. She had learned to channel the protective forces of the land, ensuring good harvests for local farmers, favorable weather for important events, and even healing properties in the herbs she cultivated. "I have come to see our role not as a burden, but as a privilege," she had written near the end of her life. "We are guardians of something ancient and precious. Through our connection to the land, we help maintain the balance between human civilization and the natural world. This is sacred work, even if it requires personal sacrifice." The more Camilla read, the more she understood why her grandmother had chosen her as the heir. Eleanor had been looking for someone who would not just accept the binding but embrace it. Her love of gardening, her quiet nature, and her deep appreciation for growing things had marked her as someone who might thrive in the role of guardian rather than simply endure it. Armed with this knowledge, Camilla decided to stop fighting the changes she was experiencing. Instead of being frightened by her nocturnal walks in the garden, she began to pay attention to what was drawing her there. She started keeping a journal of her own, documenting the sensations and insights that came to her during these episodes. What she discovered was remarkable. During her nighttime wanderings, she was not sleepwalking in any conventional sense. Instead, she was entering a state of heightened awareness where she could perceive the needs of the entire estate. She could sense where the soil needed attention, where plants were struggling, where the natural balance was being disrupted. The gardens were not just calling to her, they were communicating with her. Mrs. Ferguson and Jamie, once they understood that Camilla was beginning to accept her role rather than fight it, became enthusiastic supporters of her transition. They shared stories Eleanor had told them about her own experiences, and they helped Camilla interpret the changes she was undergoing. Lady Eleanor always said that the manor chose its guardians wisely, Mrs. Ferguson explained one morning as they walked through the rose garden. She believed that each woman who inherited the estate brought exactly the qualities needed for her time. "You're arriving at a moment when the world needs guardians more than ever." This perspective helped Camilla see her situation in a larger context. Environmental challenges, climate change, and the disconnection between modern life and the natural world had created a crisis that traditional approaches couldn't address. Perhaps her role as a guardian was not an ancient burden, but a modern necessity. She began experimenting with her developing abilities. Following Eleanor's journal entries as a guide, she learned to enter the heightened state of awareness deliberately rather than only during unconscious episodes. In this state, she could sense the health of individual plants, the movement of wildlife through the estate, and the subtle energy flows that connected all living things on the land. The results were immediate and dramatic. Under her conscious guidance, the gardens began to flourish in ways that amazed even Jamie, who had decades of experience with the estate's unusual vitality. Plants that had been struggling began to thrive, and new growth appeared where it had never been successful before. More importantly, Camilla discovered that her influence extended beyond the manor's immediate grounds. By focusing her attention on the broader landscape, she could sense and address environmental problems throughout the region. When a disease threatened the apple orchards in the valley, she was able to direct natural healing forces that contained the outbreak. When drought conditions threatened the local farms, she found she could influence weather patterns to bring needed rainfall. These experiences were intoxicating in their power and significance, but they also came with a price. As Eleanor had warned, the deeper Camilla's connection to the land became, the more isolated she felt from ordinary human relationships. Her phone calls with Sarah became less frequent and more strained. When her parents visited for a long-planned reunion, she found it difficult to relate to their concerns about her living alone in such a remote place. "You seem different," her mother observed during their stay. "Distant, somehow. Are you sure you're happy here?" Camilla struggled to explain how she could be both happy and fundamentally changed. The person who had left Millbrook no longer existed in the same way. She had become something more complex, someone whose responsibilities extended far beyond her personal desires and needs. The hardest conversation came when Sarah visited for a week during the summer. Her oldest friend was clearly troubled by the changes she saw in Camilla. "You used to be so accessible," Sarah said during one of their walks through the gardens. "Now it feels like part of you is always somewhere else, thinking about things I can't understand." Camilla wanted to explain, but how could she describe her role as a guardian to someone who lived in the normal world? How could she convey the weight and wonder of being responsible for the spiritual and environmental health of an entire region? "I found something here that I didn't know I was looking for," she said finally. "A purpose that feels bigger than anything I ever imagined for myself." Sarah's response was kind but sad. "I'm happy that you found purpose, Cam. I just wish it didn't feel like I was losing my best friend in the process." That conversation haunted Camilla for weeks afterward. She understood now why Eleanor's portrait had shown such complexity. The joy of finding one's true calling mixed with the sorrow of growing beyond the relationships that had once defined her. But as autumn arrived at Rosewood Manor, Camilla experienced something that helped her put her transformation into perspective. A severe storm threatened the region, the kind of weather event that could devastate crops and potentially harm the community. As she felt the storm approaching, she also sensed that she had the power to influence its path and intensity. Working in concert with the natural forces she had learned to understand, Camilla guided the storm away from populated areas and toward regions that needed the rainfall. The experience required every bit of strength and skill she had developed, but when it was over, she felt a deep satisfaction that no personal achievement had ever provided. The next morning, reports came in of minimal damage despite dire weather predictions. Local farmers found their fields watered but not devastated. The village had experienced dramatic lightning and thunder, but no harmful winds or flooding. Mrs. Ferguson found her in the conservatory the next morning, exhausted but glowing with accomplishment. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said softly. "You've become exactly what she hoped you would be." As winter settled over the highlands, Camilla began to understand the full scope of her inheritance. She was not just the owner of Rosewood Manor, she was its guardian, and the guardian of everything the estate protected. The role required sacrifices she was still learning to accept, but it also offered fulfillment beyond anything she had ever imagined. She thought often about the words she had heard that first night in her new home, words that had seemed like a prayer, but now felt like a prophecy. She had indeed proven worthy of her grandmother's trust, but in ways she could never have anticipated when she first received that letter with the royal seal. One evening, as she sat in Eleanor's study, updating her own research journals, Camilla reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The quiet librarian from Millbrook was gone, replaced by someone far more complex and powerful. But rather than mourning that loss, she felt grateful for the opportunity to become who she was truly meant to be. She picked up her pen and began to write, documenting her experiences for the woman who would someday inherit Rosewood Manor after her. Like Eleanor before her, she wanted to leave a guide for her successor, a roadmap for embracing rather than fearing the extraordinary destiny that came with their family's legacy. "The binding is not a curse," she wrote, echoing her grandmother's words. "It is a calling to serve something larger than ourselves. The choice we face is not whether to accept it. That decision was made centuries ago. The choice is whether to find joy and purpose in the role we have been given, or to spend our lives fighting against our true nature." Outside her window, snow began to fall on the gardens that were now truly her own. In the morning, she would walk among them in her new role as their guardian, listening to their needs and tending to their health. It was not the life she had planned, but it was the life she had been born to live. And for the first time since receiving her inheritance, Camilla felt completely at peace with the path that lay ahead.